when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Okay, so what did they see? The star. It says, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. After such a long journey, after such a long walk and camel ride, the star stopped. Think about that from an emotional point of view. At some point, you would think the star is never going to stop, right? At some point, you would think, we're just going to keep going. We're going to follow this thing back to across the street at our place back there. That's the way this thing's going. Right? We should have went west. Right? You know, but the idea is that after this long trip, the star kind of stops. And the Bible says that they were overjoyed when they saw the star, because they realized finally, after all this time, their resilience to be before the king was paying off. That they were finally getting to go in and see him. They were finally getting to get what they came for. Now, what they came for is a little different, but what they finally get to enjoy it, they finally get to see it. So they've done this long trek, and finally they come to this place, and they're sitting there going, it's stopped. That's the house. That's the place. That's where we wanted to be. For however long we've been on the road, we now have our moment. And it says they were overjoyed. They were overwhelmed with emotion just at the stopping of the star. There's the place. There's the location where we finally get to see this one that we've come so far to see. And our resilience is finally paying off. And then it says that on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped. So now there's this period of joy, of enthusiasm when they see that the star has stopped, and then they come into the house. And into the house, not the barn, not the manger. When they come into the house, they see Mary sitting there with the child. And it says they bowed down and worshiped. So now you have these men whose journey has come so far, who've gone through so much to see him, that finally when they are in the presence of Jesus, in his house, right? In his house, the only thing they can think to do in that very moment is to bow down and worship him. In the presence of Jesus, in his house, there's no mistaking their desire. So these men, they take a moment, they bow down, they worship, they give Jesus the adoration he's due. We don't know what words they necessarily exchanged with the parents. I'm sure they were amazing and very praiseworthy. I'm sure they sat back and told stories about what had happened with the shepherds and the angels and the entire event, you know, and their own journey because of the census and everything that they had been through. And so here they are sitting there in the presence of the King of the Jews as a child on the lap of his mother. And these men stand there, they look at him, they bow down, they worship him, they give him the praise he's due because they know they are in the house of the King. And you cannot enter the house of the King unless you are prepared to praise and worship him. And they did. And I think sometimes we miss that. In our desire to be a little bit more casual, we lose sight of the reverence required of us. We lose sight of it, and we become very comfortable with irreverence. We become very comfortable with not approaching God in a reverent manner while we are in his house, while we are with his people. But yet these men came into the presence of a child, and they understood the truth. And they knelt and they worshiped him. Now think about that from a mother's perspective for a minute. How far have you traveled? All the way from the east. Well, how far is that? It's a long ways. And what are you doing here? You see him bouncing Jesus, right? Right? Come on, all the moms are thinking, yeah, totally bouncing Jesus. Right? Well, Well, we would like to praise and worship your child. Okay. Right? But that's what it was, because they were in the house of Jesus. They were in the house of God, the ruler of all. Glory to God in the highest. And on earth, peace, goodwill toward men. That's who he was. They'd come so far, their resilience, their continued pushing through storms and difficulties and cold weather, because it was December. Cold weather and all of the things. It was cold. It was cold. And so they pushed through all of these things. And they worked so hard to get there. Now they're in the presence of Jesus, and they were not about to take it casually. But how many times do we take it casually? We walk in and we go, Jesus is groovy and cool. He's just happy I'm here. No. We are to have reverence in the presence of the King. Even if that king is a child. Even if that king is an infant. Unable to speak. Unable to communicate. We are still to have reverence because of who he is. The angels knew that. We learned from the angels that they understood the divine truth of who Jesus was. And so they went ahead and had a huge choir show up. Even though he was in a barn. And the shepherds knew it because the angels had foretold what was going on, and they heard and then they saw the truth, and then they couldn't do anything but go share with everybody they knew. Everybody they ran into in the streets, because they knew who Jesus was. What we have done is we have taken this idea of Christmas in this country and we've just mutilated the tar out of it. It's so confusing. Even to people who love God, Christmas is confusing. Because we've lost it. I don't know that we ever really had it, so please understand that. I think anytime you make a holiday out of something, you're asking for it. But the reality is we've lost it and we're so confused, but this is really a reverent truth that Christmas is. Now on Easter, we take a very reverent approach, right? You don't go into church on Easter and be like, woo! No, you go into church on Easter and like, it's good service, I believe. You know, we have a very reverent approach. But when it comes to Christmas, we have a very cute approach. Oh, so nice, baby Jesus. You know, I'm not going to go all Will Ferrell, but that's the reality. Is we have this idea of baby Jesus, right? Those little gold diapers, you know? But that's what we have until we lost it. Here, these wise men come so far. Now think about it. They come walking in from a long, dusty trip. And it doesn't say that they have the same reverence in the face of Herod. The king says they listened to him, right? After they listened to Herod, they moved on. Right? But when they walked into the presence of Jesus, they bowed down and worshiped. Because they understood the difference between men and God. And then it says, they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. I was thinking this morning as I was typing this stuff in. Warned in a dream. I wonder what that meant. Because Herod doesn't seem to have anything against them, right? I wonder if it was God warning to the dead. It's kind of a rough dream. That's why they like just put warned in a dream. That's good. Thanks, Matthew. But it says that they opened their treasures, that they opened their gifts. Now we know, as we've all read on through the Christmas story, that after this event, they run off to Egypt out of fear. Now it's interesting that in their last act of what we believe to be the Christmas story, right? We always include the wise men in the Christmas story. Okay? Even though we know they weren't necessarily there that day. That the last thing that takes place is these men come from forever away to bring to the family of Jesus large gifts of cash. Because after this, they were exiled in Egypt for years, waiting for Herod to die. Right? If you ever been on the lam, you need cash. Right? I was waiting to see if anybody nodded. Yeah. I heard. But this gift that they open their treasures is like one of the things that we do is we forget that part of their worship wasn't just the showing up and honoring Christ with their words and with kneeling down and with bodily action, but actually bringing gifts to him in that moment, bringing valuable gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, as much as bowing down and worshiping was a major part of what they came to do, they had left with treasures for him. So this entire trip, they've been carrying these treasures to lay at the feet of this baby king. They've been called to bring money to this baby king. Because that's what gold is. We get that, right? It's exchange. It's currency. And I think sometimes we get a little bit weird with that, but that's just what it is. And so they brought this gold, these gifts of valuable gifts that Jesus didn't have a lot of use for at 2 years old. Right? Oh, myrrh. Fantastic. I was hoping I'd get myrrh this year. And so they brought these gifts of value to who? To the parents. Right? Because God said, I want you to give birth to my son, the redemptive lamb. But I'm going to take care of you along the way. I'm going to make sure that you have what you need along the way. And I'm going to go ahead and make a phone call to guys in the east and have them bring it. And don't worry, they'll be there just in time. Right? And one of the things that's interesting is that they show up. They're the ones that make Jesus' presence known to Herod. Right? And then they provide Jesus' family with the money to get away from Herod, who didn't know he was there to begin with until they showed up. You're going to think about that one the rest of the afternoon, right? Yeah, that's really got something going with it. So they show up and they bring these gifts. So their gifts of worship were the treasures that they brought. It wasn't just the attitude of their heart that was enough. It was the fact that there had to be these gifts in order for God's plan to take place. And sometimes we struggle with that a little bit, and I think that's fair. And I think if you do struggle with it, I hope you do, because I think it's out of the goodness of our heart that we struggle with this idea that God needs us to do stuff for His plan to take place. But the reality is, in this case, He called people to do something critical to His plan. Joseph and Mary had nowhere to go as a carpenter going to a foreign land without money. And so the reality is that God provides them the nest egg, the ability to go and be exiled in Egypt for as long as it took for Herod to pass away, for Herod to move on. They did what they had to do. And so there was this provision that came from those from the east. And so a lot of times I think we don't understand that that's part of our worship. And so when we look back at what we learned through this process, we see that from the angels we learned to worship Christ because of who He is in the eternal plan. The angels knew in the divine truth who Jesus was, that He's worthy of all of our worship. As Christians, as the more mature we become, like it says in Hebrews, the more we should learn, and the more we know, the more we should worship. We have to be very careful as Christians to not become more mature, become more stale, and less worshipful. The more mature we become as Christians, truthfully, the more worshipful we should become. The more desiring to worship we should be. It shouldn't be old hat. It shouldn't be, I've done that. I'm a mature Christian now. This is how mature Christians stand during worship.